Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're exploring a really fascinating and intimate piece of writing.
Yeah, it's called Becoming the Receiver, a celebration of autistic emergence by Jaime Hoerricks, PhD.
Right, and it's a Substack post, so it's got this very personal, reflective feel.
Exactly. Less formal academic paper, more
Yeah.
deep personal insight, which honestly gives it a unique kind of power.
Absolutely. So, our mission today is really to unpack this, to, get into Shami's experience of autistic emergence alongside their gender transition they mentioned being 1 year on HRT.
And this core idea that keeps coming up, not finding a voice, but becoming the receiver for one.
That's it. That's the hook. It feels like a really fundamental shift in perspective.
Instead of actively searching for something missing, it's more about realizing they were always getting this signal.
Which brings up these themes we'll explore, right? Resonance, harmony,
Yeah.
moving from that feeling of noise to something clearer.
Yeah, that shift from noise to harmony, it's central.
Okay. And for you listening, we know you want to get the core insights quickly and thoroughly. So we're going to pull out the most significant and thought-provoking parts of Jamie's reflection here.
Really get to the heart of it.
So let's dive right in. This central idea, becoming the receiver. What were your sort of initial reactions to that metaphor?
Well, what struck me immediately was that shift, It's not about effortfully locating something. It's about perception, tuning in.
Right. Cultivating the ability to perceive what was maybe always there.
Exactly. And Jamie talks about this path not being linear, but circular,
Yeah.
but not just repeating things.
No, it's a return to resonance is how they put it, which feels different.
It does. And they're very clear. This isn't a redemption arc. It's not about fixing something broken.
Which is such a common narrative sometimes.
It is. But here it's framed as becoming and also remembering, like remembering an inherent signal.
Okay, and this connects to that concept they bring up, retrocausality. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not saying the past events literally change, but our present understanding, our current self, can reshape the meaning of those past events, especially, they note, with access to new language or frameworks.
That makes a lot of sense. How you interpret the past shifts based on where you are now.
Exactly. And for Raimi, transition played a huge role here, described as a spiral inward,
A spiral inward.
a deeper connection to their body, their sensory world. And this allowed those older, maybe previously confusing internal messages or feelings to suddenly click, to make sense in a new way.
So it created coherence for past experiences.
Yeah. And language itself changed. It went from feeling like a strain, something effortful, to being like a tuning fork, something that just resonates naturally. Words become kin.
Wow, kin. That's a powerful image. Not just tools, but related.
It suggests a much deeper inherent connection. And the mechanism, Jimmy points to resonance, a frequency shift.
Associated with estrogen, they mention a softening, a quieting of internal static.
Yes, like uncovering a melody they were already humming, but couldn't hear clearly over the noise.
And despite the real difficulties autistic and trans people face, which Jamie acknowledges.
Right, they really choose to center the joy in this.
Yeah, that profound astonishment of finally hearing themselves clearly, speaking in their own tongue.
It's a recurring theme, and this becoming the receiver really intensified during that first year on HRT.
Which brings us to that next section, the year of returning signals, HRT and the unburying of voice. Tell us about this shift in language, how things went from being sort of stuck.
Yeah, the word they use is Drek, stuck in the throat.
Right, to flowing easily.
Well, the key distinction Jamie makes is between knowing the words intellectually
Okay.
and actually feeling them, having that internal alignment. Phrases that were inaccessible before, not because they didn't know them.
But because they didn't feel right or weren't reachable.
Exactly. Now they emerge fluidly, instinctively. They call them gestalts.
Gestalt's like whole chunks of meaning, right? Not just word by word.
Precisely. Whole units. Things that previously felt like static or just pressure, now forming into language without that struggle.
So HRT wasn't just physical. It was, as James says, linguistic, sensory, poetic, a year of receiving.
On multiple levels, yeah. Like the nervous system itself recalibrated. Language arriving in full vessels, complete, not needing to be pieced together.
That ties into their earlier writing, doesn't it? About transition being narrative, too.
Yes, scripting and declaring one story. The insight here is that the signal, their true voice or way of being, was always broadcasting.
But transition allowed them to finally come online as the receiver.
And that triggered this rush from the archive. Not just memory, but recognition, coherence, things falling into place.
It really reframes how we might think about Gestalt processing.
Absolutely. Jaime pushes back on the idea that it's just a delay.
Right.
They describe it more like a deep archive, full of meaning, but maybe not aligned with linear time. The words, the feelings were there, just inaccessible, blocked by dysphoria, by that internal noise.
And transition kind of lifted that.
Yeah, lifted it, revealed the song, returned to pitch.
And this clarity wasn't just about basic communication. It affected metaphor, poetry.
Right. Those became more natural, precise, a way of orienting themselves. So the world didn't necessarily get easier.
But they became more fluent in their own way of being, speaking from within themselves.
Exactly. Speaking from that place of inner alignment, which connects to how their sensory experience changed too, moving them from, well, that state of noise.
Okay, let's get into that. From noise to harmony. This really captures the before picture, sensory-wise. What stood out to you there?
That feeling of the world being both too loud and too far away at the same time, that really hit me.
Yeah, that's a powerful description. Sensory dissonance.
These overlapping broadcasts, as they put it, and a deep feeling of mismatch between their inner rhythm and, their body, their voice, the language they were given.
Leading to that painful feeling of being broken or bad at being human.
Which is heartbreaking. And crucially, it wasn't just too much input. It was the mismatch.
Like the channels were open, but the frequencies were scrambled, receiving everything but their own signal.
Precisely. Which makes those standard labels overwhelm, alexithymia, processing difficulty feel inadequate. Jaime calls them stiff clothing.
Ill-fitting. They didn't capture the actual experience.
Right. Like knowing you feel something, but not being able to access or articulate it fully.
And then transition acts as this catalyst.
A transformative force, yeah. Not dulling senses, but tuning them. Sharpening the right things, resolving the static, increasing accuracy.
So language flowed more easily, not because it was new information,
but because the internal dissonance had decreased. They were more in sync internally.
Bringing us back to, from noise to harmony, the world wasn't inherently unbearable.
But the conditions for their own internal resonance weren't there. Transition provided the instruments, allowed them to play in my key.
In Gestalt language processing, GLP became like music then. Embodied, harmonic.
That's the sense I get. And they offer this really interesting take on alexithymia.
That it might not be an absence of feeling,
but maybe a different relationship with timing. Feelings unfolding slower, being stored, waiting for the system to be less besieged, less overwhelmed.
So confusion wasn't a lack of knowing, but waiting for the right vocabulary to fit the feeling.
Exactly. And that year brought the clarity, the tuning, that joy of recognizing your own signal and letting it sing, feeling the poem I've been living all along.
Speaking from that authentic inner key, wow.
Yeah.
Which leads nicely into building new gestalts, kinship, language, and the joy of resonance. How does this feeling of phrases landing physically contribute to language?
This is where it gets really embodied, these gestalts, these whole units of meaning. They don't just land intellectually.
Right.
There's a physical sense of recognition.
Yeah.
Like a bell rung at the precise frequency. They become internal landmarks.
Built not through memorizing definitions, but through these resonant moments.
Exactly. Language development feels less like effortful study and more like mapping through the imprint of experience.
And HRT, by reducing the internal noise, made more room for that, more capacity to notice and absorb these resonant moments.
It seems to be the idea. Less energy spent decoding static means more energy for this organic emergence of language.
And this emergent language is tied to joy, to connection.
Deeply. Joyful encounters become seeds for new phrases. Connections become metaphors. Meaning isn't forced, it just reveals itself. Especially, Jaime notes, when connecting with others who also speak GLP.
Where understanding happens on a different level. Atmosphere, rhythm, not just words.
Yeah, without needing translation or justification, it's relational, meaning created in echo.
And the joy comes from being understood on your own terms, which contrasts sharply with.
With the world often demanding we flatten our speech, conform to more typical patterns.
Right. And connecting this back to identity, Jaime sees it as coalescing, unfolding.
Mm-hmm. These phrases become like time travel messages to past selves. And transition accelerated this, creating a more coherent pattern through that self-recognition.
Poems become coordinates. The language isn't explaining them, it is them.
Yes, that rooted joy of recognition. And speaking this way leaves something behind for oneself. A reminder.
Like building blocks. Always building, always writing. But now, maybe readable by others too. because they can feel it ring true.
That's the feeling. It's authentic resonance.
Which brings us to a really potent section. A joy that threatens regimes. Why is this joy framed as radical?
Well, Cream argues that this kind of joy, autistic joy, trans joy that doesn't ask permission, that speaks its own non-sanctioned language beautifully, is inherently political.
Because it exists outside of and maybe counter to dominant narratives.
Exactly. In a context where these identities are often pathologized or marginalized, simply experiencing and expressing this authentic joy becomes a form of resistance. It challenges the focus on struggle.
So the question becomes, why would this personal joy, this clarity, this voice, be seen as a threat? Why would poetry and resonance unsettle power?
And the suggested answer is quite profound. Systems of power often depend on static, on disconnection.
They thrive when people doubt their own inner signals, when they feel uncertain or uncomfortable.
Precisely, when people feel they need to translate themselves to be accepted. But this kind of joy, Jamie says, is uncontainable.
It doesn't fit neatly into diagnostic boxes or narratives of despair.
Right. And by speaking from within their own language, they create space for others to do the same, without shame.
It disrupts the expected tragic story, rejects the idea that their way of being was wrong or too late.
And that line, "I am not broken, I am not a puzzle piece, I am a poem," just perfectly captures that refusal to be defined externally.
It's not naive joy then, it's a conscious choice.
A refusal to be reduced to struggle, a deliberate act of self-definition against erasure, and ending with "speaking for us," no longer hiding. That's powerful.
It really shifts it from individual experience to something collective, a statement. Okay, so finally, the final thoughts. The celebration of emergence. James circles back here, summing things up.
Yeah, and it's so important they reiterate, this isn't a redemption arc. It's a sacred unfolding, a widening, a deepening.
And they refine that finding my voice idea again. The voice was always there.
But the internal world needed to shift to let it resonate properly, clearly.
So transition wasn't about getting something new, but creating the conditions to receive the language that was already speaking internally.
Tuning the instrument, yeah. So the scattered signal could finally be heard as song.
And those gestalt phrases returning feel like long-lost kin. There's a reverence for feelings that were maybe blurry before.
The whole sensory field opens up differently, towards harmony, not just noise.
And there's a direct address, isn't there, to fellow autistic gestalt processors.
Yes, affirming their language, its value, even if it's not always understood externally, and also a message to those who might fear this kind of joy. Essentially, we're not asking permission anymore. We're not hiding. Our past silence wasn't agreement. Our survival strategies weren't shame. We were always here, looping, building.
Wow, that sense of internal continuity, even when it wasn't visible.
Exactly. Those scattered messages from the past, returning, being recognized now, being both sender and receiver across time.
So this year of transition really enabled emergence, provided the resonance needed to feel the beauty of their own lifelong language.
And to speak it without constantly trying to fit into someone else's grammar.
The final note is one of presence, isn't it? Speaking clearly, joyfully in their own grammar, not waiting to be decoded.
It's incredibly powerful. A real celebration, as the title says.
So the key takeaway for me is definitely this profound link between autistic and gender emergence and becoming attuned, becoming the receiver for one's own inherent language, one's own rhythm.
Absolutely. That and the concepts of resonance, the shift from noise to harmony, and importantly, the political undertones, the power of unapologetic joy.
And for you listening, maybe it prompts reflection on your own signals. What inner languages, maybe not literal languages, but ways of being, are you learning to receive or speak more clearly?
Yeah, what does it mean for you to resonate with your own rhythm?
That's a great question to sit with. And maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. How might understanding your own personal resonance, your own unique inner grammar, shift how you see yourself and how you move through the world?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.